So I'm fascinated by the idea of copyrights. So I want to talk about this event that's occurring and just thinking through what it means. And I'm curious what you think of this. So
Won't just mean the start of a new year. It will also be when copyright protections expire on a number of well known books, films, and musical compositions. That includes works like All Quiet on the Western Front, Peter Pan, and the Marx Brothers musical Animal Crackers. But one work that's entering the public domain on 2024 is getting a lot of attention. CBS News senior business and technology correspondent Jolene Kent has the story.
It's a simple early rendition of perhaps the most recognizable cartoon character ever created. The 1928 animated short Steamboat Willie marks the film debut of Mickey Mouse, and Minnie, too. Now, almost 100 years later, this landmark piece of entertainment will enter the public domain, meaning Disney will lose its right to control it, and others can use the images as they wish. This was set to happen years ago, until Disney, with other groups, got Congress to pass extensions. But the last of them expires at midnight on New Year's Eve.
And what basically is happening now is that we will be able to do to the great works of Disney what Disney did to the great works of the public domain before him. And that's how creativity is supposed to happen. We build on our past.
Lawrence Lessig is a Harvard law professor and expert on copyright issues.
So this is a bit of a full circle moment then.
Absolutely. And I think Disney should celebrate that because what we know about the creativity of Walt Disney and the Disney Corporation is that they've made stories relevant to our current time.
So starting on Monday, anyone has the legal right to use Mickey and Minnie Mouse in new creative works like books and films. But there's an important caveat. It has to be the Steamboat Willie versions, not the more familiar renditions of the characters that follow.
What are the limitations? What are you not allowed to do?
You cannot use the characters in a way that misleads consumers into thinking that Disney has produced or sponsored your product.
Jennifer Jenkins teaches at Duke Law School, specializing in intellectual property and the public domain.
The way I think about that is the public domain is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
A case in point, Winnie the Pooh. He walked out of the 100-acre wood and into the public domain 2 years ago, when the original literary work lost its protection. And that led to this. Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, a critically panned, low-budget slasher film where the beloved characters go on a murderous rampage.
Blood and Honey was buzzworthy because of the shock value, because it grossed people out. But in the long run, our culture gets to decide what kinds of public domain reuses have enduring appeal. Disney is the poster child for just how valuable the public domain is. If you think about their beloved movies that we've all watched, so many of them are based on public domain works. We've got The Lion King and Frozen and The Little Mermaid and Sleeping Beauty and Snow White. I could go on. And so that makes this moment deeply symbolic and highly anticipated because Mickey Mouse is the emblem of both of those tendencies.
Steamboat Willie is getting lots of attention, but in recent years, copyright expirations have become routine. Over the years, many other characters have entered the public domain without much fanfare, including Tarzan, Sherlock Holmes, and even Frankenstein's monster.
What are some of the high profile characters that will enter the public domain in the next few years?
So we have a lot to look forward to in the next few years. We've got Donald Duck. We've got Superman. We've got Batman. We've also got movies such as The Wizard of Oz, Casablanca, Gone with the Wind. We have a lot of wonderful works and a lot of forgotten works going into the public domain in the next few years.
For CBS Saturday Morning, Jolene Kent, Los Angeles.
all right, what do you think?
That's interesting. I I remember the drama with Spider-Man a few years back with how Sony, I think, owned him, and then
Yep.
he wanted to buy
Like
there was a
Disney
lot
bought
of
Marvel. I think Sony had maybe like a cinematic, and then Disney bought the comic book version. There was like 2 versions of Spider-Man that were
Oh,
they weren't public domain, but yeah, there was 2 versions that were being sold. Yeah,
yeah, that's it. It leads to problems when people have copyrights over and like kind of a restriction on creativity. So I guess that's good that there is like possibilities for these characters to enter the public domain. Anyone can make stuff about them. Um, yeah, I guess I'm not like well informed on it. I'm like, it seems like there could be issues with that.
right.
Like
Well, you
my instinct is like there could be problems though. Like um with the whole Winnie the Pooh thing, I think it's kind of funny, but it's like something
yeah,
could happen to like destroy these characters in some way.
right.
So
Yeah, there's it's definitely what's really tricky is because there's definitely value there, and then once it's free, it's a free for all, people can just grab that value and do all kinds of ridiculous things to sort of extract the value, in ways that just really dilute the actual value of the property. But I think that the overarching thing that I'm interested in is that I think most creativity, most story creativity, is where certain symbols enter the public's consciousness, right? So you have these ideas. We just were looking at Beauty and the Beast. That's a great example where it's now almost a part of the symbolic architecture of the way we think. But let's say when you're writing a story, you are not allowed to have access to that. It's like, I think for me, the best example, of course, is Tolkien. So, I mean, his writings are incredibly deeply embedded in my like the architecture of the way I think about my in any kind of imaginary world. Hobbits are a part of it, and I could never write a book that even referenced a hobbit. Whereas when Tolkien was writing, he was writing books that were referencing elves, which he didn't invent, and dwarves, which he didn't invent. All of these existed in the public domain by the time he was writing. But that's what made up his architecture. But he's a part of my architecture, but I can't use his property.
mm,
And so I think that we're trying to find a sweet spot between making sure that the author during his lifetime can get the full benefit of what he's created and can protect the things that he's made from being, you know, dragged to the mud the way that those filmmakers were doing with Winnie the Pooh. But then after he dies, how many generations have to go by where you you've created the symbolic architecture for future generations who don't have access to using that architecture when they're actually making stories?
mm,
There's a real problem there, that needs to be resolved. And the way that Congress resolved this was that they had something like a 30-year limit, or maybe a 40. It's basically a 1 or 2 generations. And I think that, what happened with Disney was that, like, Mickey Mouse 1928 version was supposed to be released in the public domain in the '80s, and they've
mm.
made a 40-year extension, 2 20-year extensions. And so now you have multiple generations that have lived and died with that being a part of their symbolic architecture without having any access to using that when they're writing stories. Stories are supposed to be the remixture of symbolic
Yeah.
ideas. So this is where I think it's such an important topic for us to have a conviction around. What do we do with that tension?
Yeah, I feel like there's so much creative people can do with these characters. And so I feel like it could be so fun for them to just go ham and like make some kind of crossover or like,
Yeah.
just stuff like that that could be fun. Um but it can get out of hand. So it's good that there is some amount of protection around the creation of these people, but then like it can get kind of dumb. Like I remember when um Avengers 2 came out and then like Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver were in it, and they couldn't use those names because they, like, didn't have the copyright, whatever. So it's just like Wanda and Pietro. And I remember being like, "Why I love their comic book names, like, why aren't they using them?" And it's like, "Well, they can't because of legal stuff." And I'm like, "That's dumb." So, like, there is some parts that I'm like, "This is a creative thing, like, how can you own a name?" So it is a really, like, dicey, weird, like, controversial thing that's like, I feel like I can go both ways, where I could get mad on both fronts or, like, understand both fronts. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, one of the things one of the reasons why I want to bring it up kind of in our family roundup is that I think I really want us to pursue remixing and articulating really well designed symbols from stories of the past. And so we need to be aware when these things do fall into the public domain. And so things like The Wizard of Oz or Peter Pan are incredibly powerful stories that need that like I would love, I mean, as our family kind of gets into, I think, has more of a literary, critical explanation voice within the story realm because of, I think, one of the things that makes our family, I think, one of the distinctives of our family is just how much we all love stories and how much we're impacted by symbols, and I think how much we're able to, even in a lot of cases, articulate the meaning behind symbols. And so, as these to really understand which works are beginning to expire and become more available for exploration. I think we should really consider making books, writing books, explaining and remixing and playing with some of those symbols in an appropriate way. I think that it's I think we have to be aware that the fact that people can do inappropriate things with these characters and these symbols does not mean that they're now devoid of value or that we should be cavalier about the way that we're using these characters. We need to on one hand, I would love to get to play around within Tolkien's world without having any restrictions. But of course, I know that there's going to be just some of the worst art ever devised as soon as his work hits the public domain. And the fact that it was protected is what gave us Peter Jackson's trilogy. Like we never would have nobody would have ever spent $100 million on that intellectual property if they couldn't protect it. And so I have a lot of, I I do think that there needs to be a season where it's protected and that people with a profit incentive are able to get the maximum value out of it before it starts to lapse into the public, and then I think the peasants get to play.
I'm just afraid of, like, the rings of power, like, they
Yeah.
or, like, conveyed
Yes.
what's the word there? Like, they just did not convey the correct spirit of
Right.
Tolkien, and even that was, like, legal.
Right.
So it's like, what's gonna happen
It
when
doesn't protect
everything's
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. They deeply violated the basic ethical world of Tolkien. This is to me the unforgivable sin of Rings of Power. That they use those symbols and they use them in ways that Tolkien would have been absolutely appalled at its meaning. And Peter Jackson was so clear in his interviews that they were not going to try to use Tolkien's works to preach an ethic that he would not have agreed with, but to just go along with the brilliant way that, I mean, Tolkien was such a wise man. And so this is one of the things that, yeah, the copyright doesn't protect you from potentially misusing the works. And so that's going to be done. And I think Disney and Frozen, really violated that, and I think they violated it in multiple movies that they've made. I've heard that a part of the way that what they did with the Little Mermaid. So yeah, I think you always run that risk, but on the other hand, I think that it's useful to let people use the symbols and play with them and try to see if those symbols actually do support their ideologies. And one of the things I loved about Rings of Power is that so many people saw through it and it just didn't resonate. And I think that that's very instructive when you try to force an ideology. What's going on with Snow White, the remake of Snow White, is really clear that the public can sense when you are, yeah, when you're basically doing violence to the world the symbolic world that was originally created in order to make propaganda. Like we can tell, and you're going to pay for it. And I think that sometimes people that may not have nearly the control of the property because it's in the public domain can actually unveil some of the really beautiful, true, and hidden meanings in a lot of these stories.